Okay, we're going to go ahead and get started. We're about straight up at 9 o'clock. I think the roads are a little sketchy this morning, so there might be some people sliding in here a little late, and we won't stare at them and heckle them when they walk in. So thanks again for coming this week. I'm Tyler Williams. For anyone new, I think I recognize most all of you. But today we've got a topic on ag policy and then also on some ag data through USDA-National. So we've got a couple topics that I know people always pay attention to. So we thought it'd be good to bring in the two best that I know to talk about this stuff. So again, I first off want to thank Climate Field View. They're sponsoring today. So if you know anyone that works with Climate Field View, or maybe you do, you can thank them for helping out today. And so as per usual, if you have questions in between, please feel free to jump in. Some of you have probably heard maybe bits and pieces of Farm Bill already, so you've thought about it at home a little more, and now you can ask Brad the hard questions and see if we can stump him. But so first up today, we'll have Brad Lubben. He's an ag policy specialist at UNL. He'll go here for about an hour or so, and then we'll take a break and some overall discussion. And then we'll have Nick Streff from USDA-National come in after that. So I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Brad. He probably doesn't need much of an introduction, and this is Brad with a beard, so if you don't recognize him right away, he'll take a minute. So thanks, Brad. I appreciate you coming in. And
all right. Yes, I think Mike's good. I think we're operational. I will want that. Thank you. Tyler, thank you for the invitation. I appreciate the chance to come out here and be part of this series on a regular basis, and appreciate the chance to talk about farm policy as we approach a final decision, or at least an initial decision under this new Farm Bill. I've been lots of places talking farm policy. This is the shortest drive I've had to make, so I greatly appreciate that. It wasn't necessarily the easiest drive. Our kids got the wonderful call at 5 a.m. to say school was canceled today, and so I said, does that mean work's canceled too? No, work, yeah. I can still get to Lincoln. We're in good shape. But it's good to be with you and good to talk policy. We did a number of meetings across the state, including one in this room back in December, I believe, and to talk about farm programs and Farm Bill details. But we also said, well, there's a decision coming up, and it's due on March 15. I find out March 15th is a Sunday, so technically it'll be March 16. But that decision is coming up, and this gives me an opportunity to be here and to talk about some of the details to make sure that you're getting toward that comfortable decision. And the more you understand, the more you think about the current market situation and the outlook, the better perspective or maybe more confidence we have in how to make that Farm Bill decision. And I also want to spend a little bit of focus to say, well, if you made a Farm Bill decision, how does that affect the rest of your decisions? That's sort of in keeping with the overall management strategy on the farm, is to recognize that this isn't just an isolated decision by itself. When you talk Farm Bill, you also have to think about crop insurance, and maybe you also think about marketing. And fundamentally, remember, all these things really do fit together. So we want to talk Farm Bill details, decisions. Our team of extension educators that are focused in ag economics did a number of these meetings across the state. I did some as well. But this information really is to provide what we can on the Farm Bill so that we can help understand it. So if you have any questions, please ask as we go. We want to help interpret it and think about some of the decisions ahead for producers. We do have this information available online as well, including a recording of some of the material and some of the FSA presented material as well. So farmbill.unl.edu, which will show up on our last slide, is a website where you can go and find this info for further review. Excuse me. So we're going to talk about a farm program, which means we're going to talk about ARC and PLC. Agricultural risk coverage at the county level, ARC-CO, or at the farm or individual coverage level, ARC-IC, and price loss coverage, or PLC. When we talk about this Farm Bill, we knew that there are some changes to those programs, and it's worth thinking about what those changes really meant. And then we want to talk about the decision, because that's fundamentally the biggest component of this Farm Bill, is that there is a new decision between these programs. And if we talk about farm programs, we can talk about a little bit about crop insurance. This isn't a full crop insurance talk, but there are some crop insurance elements, and particularly something called supplemental coverage option, that does hinge on how you sign up for the farm program. And so it's worth considering how that relates. And it's hard to talk about farm policy if you don't also mention the other work that FSA is doing right now as well, rolling out trade assistance, rolling out ag disaster assistance as we go. So we're going to talk about ARC and PLC, and then I want to focus specifically on the decisions that you face as producers. The first decision, frankly, is a take it or leave it decision. If you have an opportunity to update payment yields, do it. Because whether you sign up for ARC or PLC, that payment yield gets attached to the farm and it stays with that farm up until the point that we have another payment yield update opportunity. And we can never predict exactly when that may happen. So it's worth updating payment yields if you can. Then we face this decision between ARC and PLC. And the decision between ARC at the county level and PLC is a farm-by-farm, crop-by-crop decision. Every single crop on every single farm, as in FSA farm number, really has a distinct decision. Then you may also consider ARC-IC, that individual coverage or farm-level coverage. That's a farm number by farm number decision. And for some producers and in some situations, ARC-IC may be the valuable and preferred choice. So we'll take a look at what ARC-IC really is and how that works out and why it might matter particularly for some producers. If we think about PLC, the best way to understand PLC is to sort of acknowledge that it's been with us for a long time. The 18 Farm Bill technically reauthorized PLC from the 14 Farm Bill, but if you've been farming before the 14 Farm Bill, PLC looks just like something that we called countercyclical payment, which we implemented in 2002. And if you were farming a few years before that, it looks just like something we used to call target prices and deficiency payments that were implemented in the 1970s. It's still the same basic price-based safety net. Set a target price or a reference rate, and if season average prices fall below it, the program pays the difference. So that's fundamentally what we have in front of us. Now acknowledge it pays not on actual production, it pays on a farm program payment yield. Thus the focus on payment yield updates. It pays on 85% of the base acres, not the actual acres you plant, but your base acres, times 85%, times the payment yield, times the payment rate, if there's a payment to be made. So we do want to focus on how that works. We want to focus on the payment yield, and we want to focus on this potential impact or support that PLC may provide. The payment yield is really straightforward, but the equation looks exceedingly complex. It's straightforward in the sense of, in 2014, you had an opportunity to update payment yields, and it was simple. 90% of your average from 2008 to 2012. Compare that to your existing yield and update it if you could. In 2020 now, you have this opportunity to update payment yields to reflect 90% of the 2013 to 2017 average. But then we're also going to multiply it by an additional factor, which is equal to the 8 to 12 national average divided by the 13 to 17 national average. Which is to say, I'm giving you an opportunity to update your payment yields only to tell you to back it up according to national yield trends over that same time frame. Why sort of propose an update and then only sort of back it up anyway? Well, it's worth acknowledging sort of the political origin of this update, and that is it came from the House Ag Committee chairman, who comes from the High Plains of Texas, where they had substantial multiple years of drought. And if you look at the Southern Plains in counties that had multiple periods of drought during the period of the last Farm Bill yield update, then it's quite possible that that yield update opportunity in 14 was really somewhat unfair because their history wasn't very good. And so the proposal came to really allow just those areas that had multiple years of drought an opportunity to update payment yields. Of course, as Farm Bill politics go, a proposal that favors a particular program or a crop or region ultimately became a compromise that said everybody gets to update, but we're going to update and then we're going to back it up so that everybody's effectively on the same level playing field that they were. So let me give an example of how that works. I had prepared some numbers back in the fall when we did a couple trainings across the state. We did a training up in Meade. We did a training in North Platte. So you're stuck with looking at a Saunders County or Lincoln County example. But imagine a yield of 142 on corn in Saunders County. Yields on the farm in 13 to 17, entirely hypothetical, so not a direct illustration of what's going on there. But you'll take a 5-year average. If any one of those yields is particularly low, you might plug in 75% of the county average yield instead. And so in 1 year, I made it artificially low, so I plugged in the county yield. I'm averaging those 5 numbers. That simple average from 13 to 17 is 178. Multiplied by 90%, that's 160. I multiply it again by a national factor. Add 8 to 12 yields divided by 13 to 17 yields. And for corn, that national factor is a 0.9, another 90%. So I multiply it by another 90%, and I'm effectively given an opportunity to update my yield to 144 compared to the 142 that I was at. Big whoop, right? All this opportunity, I can go prove yields, and I might end up with a wash. That might very well be the case, but it's worth doing if you can do anything to improve it. Particularly if you had poor yields in the last update from 8 to 12, this is the opportunity to overcome that gap. Or frankly, like a lot of Nebraskans, if you had a pretty good period from 13 to 17 and you outperformed national trends, then chances are you're going to see a better opportunity to update yield as well. So it's effectively only washing out the trend effect over that time period, but if you had a history that was below or you have a recent history that was above, there's a good chance that updating yields is really going to mean something substantial on the farm. And as I said, it's a simple choice. If you can update yields, do it. If you don't have a better number, stick with what you have. It's also as simple as certifying what that yield history on your farm is. Using crop insurance records, the same data that justifies your crop insurance report is the same data that justifies the yield update to USDA. So certify to those yields, face potential spot checks during the life of the farm bill, same as you do with crop insurance, and fundamentally that's the process here. It's not carrying in every ticket, every receipt, every warehouse or scale ticket to prove it now. It's certifying what can be proven. One challenge, remember this is by FSA farm number. FSA farm numbers and crop insurance units don't necessarily match up, so there's some work to be done in terms of proving and certifying those yields. But if you can do it, it's definitely worth doing. Now, as I noted, you multiply this number by 90%, and then you multiply it by a national factor as well. Just for simple purposes, just take that 90 times that 90, and it's an 81%. For corn, that means the decision really is take the 13 to 17 average, multiply it by 81%, compare it to what you have now. And if it's worth updating, do it. For soybeans, it's also 81%. For grain sorghum, it's actually 81.7. For wheat, it's a little bit higher at 85.9. That national factor can't be less than a 0.9. It can't be more than a 1. And so everybody's number is somewhere between an 81 and a 90% when they do this for the crops. Other crops, we have a table of those if you have interest. There we go. Now, that's the PLC payment yield update. Do it on the farm if you can do it. Regardless of whether you sign up for ARC or PLC, having an opportunity to update that payment yield is worth doing. If you sign up for PLC, then we understand a little bit about what the expectations are in terms of support from that program. You have a reference price. And another feature of the 2018 Farm Bill was that there's a possibility of updating or increasing that reference price. And the update is something called the effective reference price, which would be the higher of the existing reference price or 85% of the 5-year Olympic average. There's also a cap that says it can't be more than 115% of the existing reference price. So somewhere between reference price and 115% of reference price. If the 5-year Olympic average moves high enough, we may actually increase reference rates. Now, if I look at real numbers today, and I can look at the market prices from 13 to 17, the 5-year Olympic average, I throw out the high, I throw out the low, I average the rest, and it's already a 356 on corn. That's already below 370, so it's just not going to happen, right? Soybeans, throw out the high, throw out the low, that averages to a 963, but 963 times 85% gets me an 819. Compare it to 840, it's just not going to happen. So we're effectively stuck with our existing reference rates for the time being. I frankly can't envision, for these major crops, I cannot envision a price rally high enough, long enough to fundamentally change this reference rate over the life of this farm bill. Corn, for example, to get somewhere where this would be above 370, we'd have to have $6 corn. 2 years in a row. Because the first year of $6 corn would get thrown out in the average. So we'd have to have 2 years of $6 corn. If we have 2 years of $6 corn, we're not going to care much about PLC reference rates anyway. But fundamentally, we're sort of living with these reference rates for now. There are a few minor crops, minor oilseeds, pulses, where that's actually, the reference rate is actually higher already because of prices. But for our major crops, it's just not an issue here. So let's calculate a PLC payment rate. If we recognize that we're going to live with a 370 corn reference price, let's look at the 2019 crop. And if you take USDA supply and demand reports and you look at the current projection, there's a price projection of 385 on the 2019 crop. That's a projection for the season average, the national marketing year average price. If we see 385, then compared to 370, we're above the reference, and the PLC payment rate is gone. So with a little bit of price stability or price strength, PLC for 2019 crop is effectively a non-event. Now, for corn and for soybeans, that may be the case, $9 compared to $8.40. For grain sorghum, for wheat, if you have grain sorghum and wheat base, those crops are already, or at least those price levels are in the money. And there's a PLC payment sort of waiting on the table for grain sorghum and wheat base to be had. And it's fairly substantial. A 395 reference minus a 340 projected price gets you a 55-cent payment rate. If you, for illustration, take a 77 bushel average, I think is a statewide average, multiplied by 55 times 77 gives you a $42 payment. That's paid on 85% of your base acre, so it translates into 36 bucks for every base acre. But fundamentally, we're talking sizable PLC payments on grain, sorghum, and wheat, given current price levels. Now, that's if we know exactly how we'll finish on the 2019 crop. I don't know. But if I use corn as an example, if we go up, we know we don't have something. If we fall a little bit, if we fall a dime, 375 still beats 370. If we fall a little bit more, 20 cents, 365 falls below 370, we'd have a nickel payment rate. We multiply that out on an average payment yield, 7.5 bucks an acre, translates into 638 per base acre. So we start talking about PLC payment rates if only we see a little bit of drop in market prices. Again, these are projections of the national marketing year average price. At this point in time, we're about 5 months into that marketing year. So even if we see a lot of price movement between now and August, a lot of that marketing year average is already built into the equation with sort of known sales. So I don't anticipate a lot of movement, but clearly if we have an estimate of 385, we have some uncertainty around it as to where we might really end up. So we're not solid on exactly what that number is. There's a reason to want to calculate and analyze some of the potential distribution around that number. Now compare PLC to ARC. PLC is a price-based safety net. ARC, agricultural risk coverage, is really a revenue-based safety net. Excuse me a moment. PLC isn't just a price-based safety net, it's a price-based safety net tied to a specific reference price. ARC is a revenue-based safety net tied to a moving average revenue benchmark. And so we're going to look at some analysis for both ARC County and ARC IC at the farm level. But it's paid on, or it's tied to this moving average revenue benchmark. It's paid on, just like PLC, paid on 85% of base acres. If you choose ARC IC, well, a farm level safety net is likely to trigger more often than a county level safety net. Thus, by virtue of the equation, it pays on fewer base acres. But we'll see how that plays out. Importantly, in ARC IC, or in ARC CO rather, we're looking at changes to the benchmark, and we're particularly looking at changes to the yield calculations. First, they're shifting from Nass data. Sorry, Nick. There's this debate about which data source is best, but they ultimately shifted from Nass survey collected data to RMA crop insurance data as their primary source of data. But even recognizing that, there's still going to be gaps in that data. They're still going to have to make committee decisions to fill in those gaps as we go. But fundamentally, we're talking about data. To protect the 2019 crop year, we would use data from 2013 to 2017. This first decision you face covers 2019 and 2020. So the 19 crop year is based on 13 to 17. The 2020 crop year is based on 14 to 18. Those are known data points. So at sign up, you know what those data points are. You know what the guarantee is. Back in 2014, we had one decision to cover 5 years. You sort of knew where we started, but you couldn't know for sure where the safety net would be by the end of the decision. This time you know exactly where the safety net is when you make the decision. You certainly won't know what the results are, but you will know what the safety net looks like when you make a decision. Now, there's yield data, there's price data that goes into this. For the yield data, as I said, we've shifted to RMA data. We've also adjusted for trend. Just like crop insurance has a trend adjustment factor available, so you can effectively ramp up the APH to current trend levels instead of history. ARC now adjusts for trend as well. And an example of that really illustrates the improvement of this. If you take raw yield data from 13 to 17, here in Saunders County, I'd looked at it, and it was a 2.2 trend adjustment factor for the 2019 crop. Well, to protect 2019, you back up 2 years to 2017, so you take 2.2 times 2 years, and you add 4.4 bushels to this yield. You add 6.6 bushels to this yield, 8.8, and so on and so on and so forth. If I was protecting ARC based on a simple 5-year Olympic average of history, I would have a 211 bushel yield in that benchmark. Because of the trend adjustment factor, I have a 219 bushel benchmark. An 8 bushel increase because of the trend, well, 8 bushel at a 370 benchmark price is effectively about a $30 improvement in the guarantee. So trend yields really do help. They do improve sort of the performance of ARC. Instead of protecting me for yield losses below a historical average, it's really protecting me against yield losses below trend. And that's certainly an improvement in the program. Now, I had some numbers in there as well. You can see an example in Lincoln County works just the same way. The ARC program, the ARC guarantee, well, you start with a benchmark revenue equal to a benchmark yield times a benchmark price. This is a 5-year Olympic average yield adjusted for trend. This is a 5-year Olympic average price with a minimum of the reference price in the equation if market prices are below reference rate. So for practical purposes, we calculated the 219 bushel yield on that previous graph. The benchmark price, well, we've spent enough years at or below reference that we're stuck at reference, 370 for corn. Yield times price gives me a benchmark revenue. Multiply that by 86% gives me a guarantee. So I don't protect against losses below benchmark, I protect against losses below 86% of benchmark. Same equation that we had before. The difference now with a trend-adjusted yield is at least it's losses below a benchmark based on trend instead of losses below a benchmark based on history. I calculate another number here as well. If you take benchmark revenue times 10%, that's as big as the ARC payment can get. It only covers losses from 86% down to 76%. It does not cover all the way to the floor. Hopefully you've got other risk management plans, crop insurance, and so forth to help protect that. But all this math is there just to say, well, that's already calculated. That's a known factor when you go at sign up. You have a revenue, I have a guarantee, I have a maximum payment rate. For illustration, if this ended up being my actual yield and this ended up being my actual price, then an actual revenue compared to the guarantee, I would have seen a small payment. That's a payment per paid acre. That's 85% of base, so I calculate that out. That's effectively $3.50 per base acre. This is an illustration. This is not my estimate of what really happened in Saunders County. Nass will release reports next month of survey-based data on county-by-county crop yield estimates. That'll be our first sort of clue as to what really the numbers look like on a county-by-county basis. FSA will specifically use crop insurance data first, but the Nass data certainly will provide good evidence of what that number would look like. So there's an illustration really to show you how this works. But the question is, how do they really compare? So I have numbers to tell you what PLC would do, and if prices drop, how PLC would kick in. I have numbers and illustrations to tell you how ARC works, and if you have a price loss or a revenue loss that in combination gets you below the guarantee, ARC kicks in. But how do they really compare to each other? So I've put this together on a price chart, which is already sort of a compromise itself. I've got a price safety net and a revenue safety net, and I'm comparing them on a price chart. But what I want to compare is effectively, look at where corn prices have moved over time. The reference rate was 263 before the 2014 Farm Bill, and it was raised to 370. And that's where it sits effectively for now as well. So if I had PLC, I'm protected against price losses below the reference rate. If I have ARC, I'm protected against price losses or revenue losses below 86% of trend yield and 5-year Olympic average price. Well, the 5-year Olympic average price back in 2014 was $5.29. If I assumed that I was going to hit my average yield or my benchmark yield, then it would have taken a 14% price loss to trigger ARC. But 14% off of 529 got me at about 455, if I remember the number correctly. And so in 2014, for corn, I'm comparing, do I want price protection that kicks in at 370, or do I want revenue protection that effectively kicks in at average yields in 455? Which one would you have preferred? Which one did you sign up for? 97+% of you signed up for ARC, for corn. Much, much stronger safety net. Well, of course, prices did drop. Prices are below PLC reference rate levels, but not anybody signed up in PLC. But they're getting big ARC payments, still pretty big ARC payments, but eventually that average drops to the point that the average is now stuck at the same 370. So I've got protection at 370 under PLC. I've got effectively protection at 370 under ARC, assuming trend yield. In 2019, I make a new decision. Let me clarify that. I've got protection at 370 under PLC. I've got protection at 86% of 370 under ARC. That's 318. Do you want PLC protection that kicks in at 370? Or do you want ARC protection that kicks in at 318, assuming trend yields? Now which one are you going to choose? That's the decision today. It's not quite that simple because we already know what's happened in 2019, at least production-wise. We're waiting on an exact number, but we have a good idea of what happened. And in some places, we've had substantial yield losses. Maybe not so much at the county level, but if you had substantial yield losses at the county level, it's possible that all that ARC deductible, if you will, is made up in terms of yield loss. And so ARC might protect us from price loss, similar to what PLC does. We can also say that the current price projection of 385 probably means that neither ARC nor PLC pays on 2019. 385 is about 370, ARC's not, or PLC is not going to pay. 385 is about 4% above 370, which means you'd need a yield loss of about 20% multiplied by a price increase of 4% to give me a revenue loss of 16% so that ARC would pay. The chances that the county actually faces a 20% yield loss are pretty remote. Even in some of our counties that had challenging production conditions this year, remember this is a yield per planted acre, not every prevent planted acre. This is a yield per planted acre. And the likelihood that we have a 20% yield loss is not very big. So frankly, today I can't tell you, or I think I can tell you, that I don't expect ARC or PLC to pay very much on corn for 2019. For 2020, I don't know where we'll be price-wise. This number is from a USDA price projection published in late November, which is part of their annual long-run baseline forecast. It's not explicitly a price forecast. It's a price projection that says, well, if you assume average productivity growth and you assume average demand growth, this is where we end up. It fundamentally doesn't assume any shocks. So it doesn't assume weather shocks. It doesn't assume new trade news, which we've had quite a bit of in the last 2 months now. So I can't promise that that's exactly what we're projected at, but the long-run projections are sort of generally mid to upper $3 corn and a pretty flat forecast, barring some shock to the marketplace. If that's the case, by 2020, we could be back in the scenario where PLC looks pretty important. And ARC, well, ARC provides protection, but probably not as quickly as PLC does. So that's a bit of a clue about sign up for corn. That's sort of the obvious case for sorghum. In part because, well, the sorghum price projection is 340. Not 385 like corn. Sorghum is at its sort of traditional discount to corn. The reference rate, however, is 395, not 370, because in the 14 Farm Bill, sorghum producers pushed for, lobbied for, and won a higher reference rate. Higher reference rate, lower price, bigger payment rates relative to corn. And so if there's sorghum base, it most likely is going to enroll in PLC. I want to forward to wheat base. If there's wheat base, very much the same scenario. All of the analysis would point strongly toward PLC for corn, PLC for sorghum, PLC for wheat. I can't promise that there will be payments on corn, but the likelihood, or at least the probability, says it looks bigger on PLC than it does on ARC. And then I back up and ask the question about soybeans. In 2014, the decision was pretty straightforward. The reference rate had increased from $6 to $8.40, but the market was coming off of record highs, and the 5-year Olympic average was $12 plus, which meant that sort of the effective protection, assuming benchmark yields, was in the 10.5 range. Did you want ARC protection that started at about 10.5, assuming benchmark yields? or PLC protection that started at 840? How many would have chosen ARC? How many did choose ARC? About like you did on corn, 97+% chose ARC. And it paid substantially. Year 1, year 2, year 3. Eventually that average 2 fell to the point that the ARC guarantee fell to the point that in the final years of the last Farm Bill, payments were virtually non-existent unless there was a very poor yield result in that county. But prices fell all the way to 848, which was still above 840 reference, which means there was still no PLC payment. So soybeans have fallen like corn, but they started higher relative to their reference rate, and they haven't fallen down to the point that PLC has actually kicked in. If I look at 2019 now, that 5-year Olympic average is about 950 or 975. That means that 86% of that is about 820. Do I want ARC protection that covers me for revenue losses that kicks in at 820 in trend yields? Or do I want price protection that kicks in at 840? That's a much more difficult question to try and answer. Based on current price projections for soybeans, it would say $9 beans for 2019. It would take a sizable yield loss to trigger an ARC payment. But $9 beans would definitely, it would take a sizable price loss before we would ever trigger a PLC payment. Again, I can't expect that either one of them will pay on 2019. But ARC and PLC are much more comparable to each other on soybeans than they are on any other crop. And so, how are you going to sign up for ARC or PLC on soybeans? I don't know. Come 2020, well, price projections are basically flat, upper $8 to $9 range, barring any sort of big shocks in the market. And so neither program may be expected to really provide much in terms of payments. Now, I put all those out there to suggest that this is sort of as simple as saying, what are my expectations? But I have to think about what's the uncertainty I have around those expectations as well. Okay, a little tangent before I get there. I mentioned ARC-IC, the individual coverage or farm level coverage program. If you sign up for ARC-IC, that's a farm number by farm number decision. It calculates revenue histories according to the crops, the program crops that you've grown on the farm. It weights those revenue histories according to your planting mix today, and then it gives you this revenue safety net to protect you against today's cropping, your current cropping. It pays on base acres. It pays on 65% of the base acres instead of 85. So there's a bit of a penalty or at least a discount in terms of the payment. But fundamentally, it protects farm level risk instead of county level risk. It protects farm level risk, which you may have, well, we have 2019 results already in the bin. If you had big yield losses in 2019, you know whether that farm might end up looking at sizable ARC-IC payments. And so this is sort of a sign up after the fact. You know, do you want to buy insurance after the house burned down analysis here? But given that this decision covers 2019 and 2020, and 2019 is already sort of a known result, if you had big losses in 2019, it may very well be advantageous to sign up for ARC-IC. And particularly if you had a farm that had sizable prevent plant acres. Important distinction. If you got anything planted on that farm number, it's the planted acre that gets calculated in the ARC-IC protection. If you had absolutely 100% prevent plant on that farm number, 100% prevent plant certified with FSA, then you technically had zero revenue on that farm to count against an ARC guarantee, and you have a maximum payment rate coming. If you had 100% prevent plant, then there's zero revenue to count against the guarantee. If you had 99% prevent plant, but you managed to get 1 acre in, the result is based on how that 1 acre did. So it's not quite as straightforward saying, well, the acres that didn't get planted are zeros and the acres that did have result. No, it's a technicality in the rule. If it's 100% prevent plant, it's a zero. If anything got planted, it's what that planted acre did. And take that further. If you sign up for ARC-IC, every farm number that you sign up for ARC-IC gets bundled together into one pool. So if this farm number had total loss and this farm number did okay, if you sign them both up, on average, you sort of washed away some of your losses. But if you had multiple farm numbers with prevent plant, 100% prevent plant, or multiple farm numbers with major yield losses because of storm effects, it's quite possible that signing them all up under ARC-IC puts you in line for major payments. And you could say, well, this is a decision about 2019 and 2020. I know the result in 2019, and that might be big payments. For 2020, I'm just sort of assuming away nothing, right? Because at this point in time, well, we expect to get the crop planted, and we generally expect trend yields, and so you're assuming no losses and you're assuming no payments. But the payments on 19 might more than make up for the fact that 2020 is a non-event. And unfortunately, there are some places in the state where the expectations for 2020 aren't much improved over 2019. A few farm numbers down on the river bottom that still look like they may or may not get planted this year. So fundamentally, it's a case-by-case, farm number by farm number analysis. But if it applies to your situation, ARC-IC is definitely worth the analysis. A little bit more before I get into actually sort of making the decision. When we think about farm programs, think about how they relate to one another. PLC is this price-based safety net, which looks an awful lot like a market hedge. Selling a futures contract, buying a put option, signing a minimum price contract, whatever. PLC is effectively a price hedge. It's tied to the season average national marketing year average price, so it's not explicitly your price level. Basis isn't part of this equation. It's only tied to your base acres and payment yields, which if I went through those equations earlier, if I update my payment yield, well, it's at best 81% of my recent production average, which itself is probably a discount to what I can grow today. So maybe my payment yield at best is about 75% of what I can grow today. And I only get paid on 85% of my base acres. I multiply all those factors out, and even if I sign up everything for PLC, it's only really protecting maybe 65% of my expected production on those base acres. So it's not a full price hedge. It is not sort of a reason to ignore marketing decisions. But it is important to remember that PLC does have some hedging features effectively built in. And if you're hedged that way, then you have to think about what additional marketing decisions or insurance decisions do I make. PLC will complement crop insurance. You got price hedging, so putting in the appropriate insurance policy. It will also complement marketing decisions or substitute for them. PLC enrollment also makes you eligible for supplemental coverage option, which I will mention here in a minute. So I try and illustrate that just to sort of draw the price hedge component here. The PLC payment rate. At 370, the PLC payment rate would be 0. If prices drop below 370, that payment rate grows all the way down to 220, which is where the new loan rate's at. PLC maxes out then at $1.50. Below 220, marketing loan gains, loan deficiency payments would kick in. Let's assume, or at least hope, that loan rates for corn are an irrelevant factor. I wish I could say that for all commodities, but wheat literally had LDP payments just 2 or 3 years ago. So it could happen, or at least it is in existence. Well, if I add that PLC payment rate to actual market prices, then theoretically, above 370, what's my price risk? Or what's my price exposure? It's according to the market. Below 370, what's my price exposure? Well, it looks flat because PLC is going to pay penny for penny on prices below 370. But as I noted, it's only going to pay on payment yields, only on 85% of my base acres. Effectively, below 370, it's going to pay some of the loss, but not all of it. And so it's just a graph to remind us that PLC is effectively a price hedge, but it is not a 100% price hedge. And you want to marry it up with whatever other marketing decisions you make. Compare that to ARC. ARC is effectively a revenue insurance policy. It looks an awful lot like RP. If you buy a revenue protection policy, you've got revenue protection based on your APH, based on the base price, or the higher of the base or futures price, and based on what protection level you buy. ARC effectively is that revenue protection policy, and it kicks in at 86, but it only covers the first 10%. But it's tied to the county. The crop insurance policy you buy is tied to the farm. ARC is tied to this benchmark price. The RP policy is tied to that year's price. So they're not quite the same thing. They're definitely not the same thing, but they look an awful lot alike when we analyze them. So I try and draw a graph of where this ends up. I add a yield axis to the price axis, and effectively imagine this slope of revenue. Every yield times price combination, you just have this, sort of straight slope up here. But then if you like reading topographic maps or visualizing in 3D here, you see what looks like a terrace or a plateau. That's where ARC kicks in. When revenue falls to that guarantee, ARC starts paying dollar for dollar on the loss. Again, only on 85% of your base acres and only on the first 10%. So ARC pays for a while and then revenue falls again. This is a reminder that ARC might substitute for, or at least work like, higher levels of crop insurance, but it definitely doesn't cover the bottom end. It really is only the shallow end of losses. Maybe it's the portion of insurance that you don't normally buy. Maybe it substitutes for some of your higher levels of coverage, but it's not the full safety net. One more slide to add in here before we get to the decision. On SCO, if I don't enroll in ARC, I have the option of looking at SCO. It was not widely used. It was authorized under the 2014 Farm Bill as an addition to crop insurance. It was not widely used, and it was hardly used at all here in Nebraska, but then again, most of the corn and soybean acres signed up for ARC, so it wasn't even a choice. But what is SCO? It's effectively a county add-on policy on top of your existing crop insurance that says it will cover from 86% down to whatever level of crop insurance you buy. It will pay out based on the county result, not your farm result. County coverage is cheaper than farm level coverage, and it's subsidized at a good rate, so county coverage is really much cheaper than the equivalent level of farm coverage. But it's also county coverage. And if you have an expected yield in the county, the distribution of yields around that might be fairly tight. If you have the same expected yield on the farm, the distribution gets bigger. There's a bigger tail on the farm. There's a bigger chance that revenue or that insurance kicks in on the farm than does at the county. That's why a county policy is cheaper. So it's hard to say that just because I'm not signed up in ARC that I should definitely buy SCO. If I make a comparison, there's this sort of a wormhole, how deep, or your rabbit hole, how deep you go, the analysis gets more and more complex. But consider if I have ARC. If I'm signed up in ARC, I have revenue protection that starts at 80% of this benchmark, and it covers me down to 76%, independent of whatever I do with crop insurance. If I buy SCO, so I don't sign up for ARC, I can purchase SCO that starts at 86%, and it covers me down to whatever level of crop insurance I do buy. If I buy 75% coverage, ARC protects me from 86 down to 75, looks an awful lot like, or excuse me, SCO protects me from 86 down to 75, and it looks an awful lot like ARC that goes from 86 to 76. They look an awful lot like the same thing. So there's a good chance that says if I don't sign up for ARC and I end up enrolled in PLC, then I should really think about buying SCO, because SCO effectively mimics the ARC coverage. And I can effectively have PLC and an ARC equivalent coverage. But remember, the SCO only covers what you don't cover with crop insurance. If you're already buying 80 or 85, I can't envision an analysis that says I should back up on my crop insurance at the farm level just so I can buy cheaper SCO coverage. I may not be buying that higher coverage because of cash flow or cost, premium cost considerations. And if I'm not buying that higher level of coverage, then I could look at SCO and say it's cheaper and maybe it's worth purchasing. If I'm already buying that higher level of coverage, then cash flow is not the constraint. And I can't really fathom giving up that good farm level coverage just to replace it with cheaper county coverage. That's without going into all the numbers, but that's just sort of the general conceptual analysis that says SCO may work if you're not buying up to higher and higher levels of individual farm coverage. And it may be worth adding on. And it's worth a visit with your crop insurance agent to talk about it. Frankly, not many of them have sold this policy in the past, given its very limited market share, but it is certainly an option. But if you're already buying higher levels of coverage, I really can't imagine backing up on farm level coverage just to look at SCO as an alternative. That's kind of where I play it out.
I got a quick question for you. So
Yes,
that
Tyler.
in our area, is that effectively just like drought coverage?
You know, SCO is this county level policy. Okay, so farm level protection, you can think of all the perils that could happen. What's the peril that's really going to pull down the county yield? Mostly it's drought. So yeah, arguably it's not going to be the hail event unless we really have enough widespread hail that the county comes down. But it's not likely to be hail. It's not likely to be too much rain because parts of the county, you know, Lancaster County, like where I grew up in Otoe County, too much rain in parts of the county was generally a good thing for us guys that were farming on the hills. So it's typically not going to be too much rain that pulls down the county yield. It's typically not going to be storm events. It's mostly drought coverage. But drought coverage or coverage on the farm is going to certainly protect you better than coverage based on the county. The county coverage is cheaper, but it's cheaper because it doesn't expect to pay as often or as much. Okay. So unfortunately, that's one slide to talk about a very complex choice here about SCO. But it's enough to put on your radar to talk to your crop insurance agent if you have more questions. Now, I promised some sort of decision points here. If I look at ARC and PLC, under sort of current stable prices or lower expectations, all of the analysis suggests that PLC will kick in faster than ARC. It's already kicking in on grain, sorghum, and wheat base. It's not far from kicking in on corn, particularly if we back up on in 2020 relative to where we were in 2019. PLC kicks in faster. So if your scenario, if your projection is sort of modest to slightly declining prices, PLC kicks in faster. That's even true on soybeans. PLC would kick in faster unless we know that we had yield losses as well. And so probably under stable to lower prices, PLC dominates the analysis. Under slightly improving price levels, and 19 frankly has improved already relative to where it started, neither ARC nor PLC may matter. For corn and beans, ARC and PLC are both currently projected to be zeros. And if we have any hope of trade progress coming to fruition in 2020, price levels see some modest improvement or continued improvement from where we're at, neither one of the programs may matter in 2020 either. So all this analysis could be about comparing zero versus zero. Under substantially higher prices, which is almost like a red herring because it's just not in the cards, but under substantially higher prices, we could envision a scenario where ARC and PLC effectively look like the same thing. PLC is tied to this increasing reference rate, ARC is tied to an increasing benchmark price, et cetera, et cetera. On a year-by-year basis, ARC IC could be very important, particularly given that we know 2019 results already in the books. If we had farm level losses in 2019 because of poor yields or because of 100% previent plant conditions, then ARC IC is definitely worth the analysis. Looking forward, it's hard to predict that ARC IC would ever sort of win the analysis prospectively, because we start every year thinking we're going to get it planted and we're going to see trend yields. But at least with retrospective analysis of 2019, we have a pretty good opportunity to analyze the role of ARC IC on a given basis here. And recognize all those decision points are based on, if you plug in a particular projection, you can calculate an exact result. But I can't promise you that that's the result you'll get. So it's good to think about the risk and uncertainty of those results. And the best way to illustrate that is with a little bit of humble pie for economists up here. Here's where corn prices have moved over time. Here's our best sort of baseline forecast of where prices go. If I look at USDA's baseline numbers, or FAPRI's baseline numbers, or the Congressional Budget Office baseline numbers, yeah, we climbed to 385 projection for 19 at the moment, but the best baseline forecast looking forward range from mid to upper $3 corn, which means that PLC's right there, maybe even in the money a little bit. But how confident am I in that baseline? Well, let's go back to 2005 and ask me how confident I was in a USDA baseline that said, well, we're at $2 corn and maybe we're on our way to $2.50. And we missed the commodity boom entirely. And in 2009, we had a projection, well, now we're around $4 corn and we stay somewhere in that upper $3 to $4 range, and we missed the top of the boom. In 2013, we were coming off of drought production and record prices, and we knew we weren't sort of living with that record high, but the projection was, well, we're falling back to a stable level between 4 and 5, which we obviously didn't do. And now here we are at mid to upper $3 corn, and that's sort of where the projection keeps us. What's that tell me? Economists are not very good at predicting shocks. We're very good at predicting straight lines. And we don't predict weather shocks, and we don't predict market shocks, good or bad. That analysis fundamentally is not about trying to forecast market events. It's about saying, if productivity continues growing, if demand continues stable growth, this is the result we get. Right now, we could be a little bit optimistic and say, hey, as much trade progress as we've made, or at least as has been announced in the last 2 months, maybe there are prospects for better prices ahead in 2020 based on increasing exports. And if those promises really come to pass, we could well be talking about higher prices over the next 12 months to the point that ARC versus PLC really doesn't matter much, because we'll be dealing with market price conditions and essentially zeroed out payments. But if you have any concern about whether those promises come to fruition, then you worry a little bit about downside and you worry about where prices could be. If I hone in a little bit more on just those out years, this is where those projections take us, but effectively mid to upper $3 corn prices. Sort of high $8 to low $9 soybean prices. We just sort of continue where we're at. No real major shifts to where we're at in terms of current long-run projections. Recognizing that I don't have much confidence in that straight line, I worry about how much possible distribution there is around that. I would suggest using the decision tools that are available online. If you go to FSA's webpage, and you've got a copy of the slides, so you've got the whole address, but the simple one, fsa.usda.gov, takes you to FSA's main page. On that main page, there's a tab called Programs and Services, and if you click on that tab, it pulls down this whole list of things. ARC and PLC are under there. If you click on ARC and PLC, it takes you to the ARC and PLC homepage, which is this page. At the bottom of this page, if you scroll down, you'll come to several boxes of sort of click on resources. One of those boxes says resources, and under it, it has connections, links to the various web tools. There are some analysis tools up there to specifically calculate or project ARC-IC, and then there are these risk-based analysis tools developed at Texas A&M University and the University of Illinois. These are the same two centers that developed decision tools under the 2014 Farm Bill, under a USDA contract. They've been working with USDA again to update those tools for the 2018 Farm Bill analysis. Either one, if you go to the Ag and Food Policy Center at Texas A&M University, or you go to the FarmDoc website at Illinois, they're going to ask you to create an ID, log in. You're able to enter data, do some analysis of projected payments and some probability around those projections. Now, they're both good tools. They will not give you the same exact answer, in part because you have to plug in your data, in part because they have to make some assumptions about price distributions and yield distributions. And even if they make the same basic assumptions, they don't necessarily agree 100% with each other. So I can't tell you which one is better. I can tell you they're both wrong, in the sense of saying, you go on this to do an analysis. If you give it a projection, if you have a projection, you could do it on paper, you get an exact result. If I have 385 corn, I can calculate that my PLC payment rate will be 0. If I go on these tools and I say I'm going to project 385 corn, it's not going to calculate 385, it's going to calculate 500 or 1,000 scenarios where prices could be around 385. And some of those scenarios fall below 370, maybe as much as 40% of them. And in those scenarios, there's a PLC payment. And when you average those scenarios across the whole spectrum, this analysis will tell you that your expected price is 385, but your expected PLC payment rate is also something more than 0, which mathematically doesn't make sense, but remember that this is a probability distribution. It's no different than looking at crop insurance and saying, well, if I hit APH, then my indemnity is going to be 0. Then why would you ever buy crop insurance? Because you know that it covers the tail, not the average. So do the analysis. Neither one of them will give you they won't give you exactly the same answer. Neither one of them will give you the correct answer. Because even out of those 500 or 1,000 draws, it's going to give you an average. But over the next 2 years, you're going to get one result. And we can come back in 2 years and tell you whether you were right or wrong, but that doesn't help you make a decision today. Do the best analysis you can, make the best decision you can today. Now, I want to finish up very briefly by noting all this talk about the Farm Bill. Really is difficult to talk farm policy without talking about the additional assistance that's come out of USDA as well. And of note, the Farm Service Agency is currently working hard to enroll producers in commodity programs with this March 15th or March 16th deadline coming up. The same Farm Service Agency is the one responsible for rolling out the trade assistance payments that we've seen over the last 2 years. It's the same group that's working on the ad hoc agricultural disaster assistance that was signed into law back in May and is rolling out here. It's also by chance the same group, not by chance, but it's also the same group that's currently accepting applications under the general enrollment for the Conservation Reserve Program. So almost everything that seems to be happening, it's happening at the FSA office. It's one of the reasons that they're working as hard as they are. The trade assistance, effectively an update. This was trade assistance on the 2019 program, primarily the market facilitation program payments. We saw trade assistance in 2018 that was the administration's answer to, we're in the midst of a trade conflict, we know there are agricultural trade losses, here's trade assistance to help fill the gap. That assistance was repeated in 2019. There was an initial payment last summer. There was a second installment late in the year, and there were prospects of a third installment, and at least in the last week or so, there seems to be promises. A third installment is on the way, probably yet to be announced this month, but we expect a third installment under the 2019 round of assistance. In the same statement, the Secretary and others have been keen to note that with progress on trade and with prospects for improved exports and hopefully price strength in 2020, they don't expect to make a third round of trade assistance for the 2020 crop. So there was an assistance on 18, there was assistance on 19, some of it yet to be paid, but probably, or at least they would argue, no expectation of assistance on the 2020 crop. Now, that's the official position. One could speculate and say, don't forget 2020 is an election year, so you can't promise that there won't be anything, but if trade progress does in fact come to fruition and we see more exports and more price strength, then I think you could effectively write off any prospects of 2020 trade assistance.
5 minutes. That's all.
Okay, I thought you had a great question.
No.
I was waiting for a great question.
I believe I only one.
All right. So importantly, note that this third round is coming. Don't plug into cash flows any expectations that there's a 2020 set of assistance to come as well. There are a couple maps in there that showed you the original calculated payment rates by county. Half of that came out in the first installment. Calculated payment rates on the second installment based on an additional 25%. The third installment is presumably going to be the last 25%, which means numbers that should look like this. The second installment and third installment really should look alike. Unless you're out here in the western part of the state where most of the money already got sent out the door, there may not be a third installment to be had. The other thing that FSA was rolling out, as I said, was ag disaster assistance. And just in one slide to sum it up, ag disaster assistance that really started as a disaster assistance package for wildfires and hurricanes was expanded to include more agricultural losses from other events. But if you're curious as to why it's called WIP Plus, it's the Wildfires and Hurricanes Indemnity Program plus other losses at this point. Those losses would include crop losses, preventive planting losses, some additional funding for preventive planting losses was added and distributed by crop insurance crop insurance companies. So those payments have already rolled out. Some losses for grain lost in storage or commodities lost in storage. Not a substantial volume in aggregate, we don't think, but clearly a major catastrophe for some producers. But for these losses to cover crop losses, this works like disaster assistance has traditionally worked. Here's an expected yield, here's an expected price, which gives you an expected revenue for the farm. We're going to protect some percent of that revenue. But every time I offer ad hoc disaster assistance, I also effectively signal to a producer, well, why buy crop insurance? Because if there's a loss, then disaster assistance comes along to pay the difference. And if I buy crop insurance, I'm out the premium cost. And that's been historically a problem with disaster assistance programs, that they effectively substitute for crop insurance. But more recently, disaster assistance programs have tried to complement crop insurance so that if you buy crop insurance, your disaster assistance will incentivize you to continue buying that insurance. And the way it does it is over here. There's a payment factor that says if I don't buy any crop insurance, I'm still going to get disaster assistance help if I need it, but it's going to kick in at 70%. So I'm going to have to swallow 30% of a loss before actual crop revenue plus disaster assistance payments makes up the difference. If I buy crop insurance, the more I buy, the higher coverage I buy, the better my disaster assistance percentage. All the way to say if I buy 80 to 85% coverage, I'm going to protect 95% of that expected revenue. I know that crop plus crop insurance indemnities are going to add up to 80 or 85%, so I'm only going to cover a small band, but I'm definitely going to cover more under disaster assistance if I buy higher levels of coverage than if I don't. And so the whole equation or the whole schedule up here is just a signal to say, don't give up on crop insurance assuming that disaster assistance will continue to cover the losses. Buy crop insurance as if you need it, buy crop insurance according to what you plan, and then if disaster assistance comes, it will reward that crop insurance decision to start with.
That covers flooding?
This would cover crop losses due to disaster events like flooding. And in a disaster county, it's frankly the entire state, almost. There are a few counties that actually have not been declared disaster in the last couple years. There's actually a couple counties down here that had below average rainfall last year, just in case you're curious. But even in those non-disaster counties, if a particular producer had a dramatic or significant loss, they may individually qualify for help as well. But for practical purposes, yes, if you had ag disaster losses on either the 18 or the 19 crop, counties that were 18, counties that were 19, counties that were both, then you can look to the ag disaster program at FSA to determine how much assistance might be available. I leave it with that. Our information from Extension is on farmbill.unl.edu. We have links to some of these resources. We have a whole set of videos up there of our presentation at recent Farm Bill meetings, the Farm Service Agency presentation at those meetings as well. So there's more of this you can review if you wish. The FSA website here in Nebraska has a great deal of information available as well. So more resources if you want it, and you know how to contact us if you have direct questions too. So let me stop at that, Tyler, and stand up here as long as you want to throw something at me.
If anyone has any questions, I can hand you the mic.
I apologize, I'm not a farmer, so.
That's all right.
You sign up for the ARC and the PLC yearly, or either ARC yearly?
Right now the producer has to visit the FSA office to make an election decision between ARC and PLC and an enrollment decision on the 19 crop and the 20 crop. In future years, starting in 2021, we can revisit this choice. You'll have to go in every year to enroll, and if you want to change your election, you have to change it. You don't, if you want to keep your election, you don't have to go back and redecide every year. You still have to go back every year to enroll. So effectively, you had to make a one-time decision back in 14 that you had to live with from 14 to 18. Now you have to make a decision that you have to live with for 19 and 20. Starting in 2021, you can revisit that decision on an annual basis.
What's the deadline date for that?
This go around, it's March 15th. Technically, March 16th is a Monday, so so that decision's due by mid-March. Same as crop insurance. So these are sort of linked together, I think, going forward. I would expect in future years it'll be the same March deadline.
And no additional cost for this? I mean, this is part of...
Farm program sign-up doesn't have a cost attached to it,
other than
unlike crop insurance.
Yeah.
Yeah, it costs somebody, yeah. It costs us all as taxpayers.
Yeah.
It has a cost in terms of compliance. Producers have to face compliance provisions for conservation, wetlands protection, et cetera. Producers have to face eligibility requirements and payment limits, but there's no technical cost to enrolling in the program.
And that disaster assistance, that has to be actually planted crops that are covered for that?
The disaster assistance as rolled out, I believe, would be, I think it would be losses on planted acres, because there was already this this crop assistance rolled out for prevent plant that attached to producers who had purchased prevent plant crop insurance coverage.
Is that the prevent plan? I'm not familiar with that. Is that if you can't plant at all?
Yeah, there's quite a bit of technical definition of, so if you didn't get it planted at all and you certified it as prevent plant with crop insurance and with FSA. But if prevent plant means, well, I was prevented from planting corn, so then I planted soybeans, that doesn't count as a prevent plant acre. That counts as a planted acre of soybeans.
And the prevent plan you pay for?
If you're buying crop insurance, prevent plant coverage costs something additional. And so the disaster assistance would be a function of if you had prevent plant coverage, there was some additional payment made. Back of the row, or back of the room there.
So I've never, never found the answer where the base acres came from, and are we ever going to get to update them? Because I still have oats on mine, and probably about 50% of my farm.
Yeah. So a very brief history of base acres. Base acres exist from actual production data that dates back to at least the 70s. But that was back in a program era where if you had a base acre, you had to plant that crop to get that support. Come the 96 Farm Bill, we had freedom to farm or flexibility, and the payments were attached to the base acre, but you had flexibility to plant whatever you wanted. So we no longer had to plant the crop in the base, but you still had to live with the base acre that you had. The 02 Farm Bill gave us a chance to update base acres. The, I believe, 8 and 14 Farm Bills gave us a chance to update base acres as well. But updating base acres wasn't always going to be the best choice, because particularly in this part of Nebraska, an old grain sorghum base acre that might have got updated to a new soybean base acre, grain sorghum was going to pay more than a soybean base acre was going to pay. And so there was incentive not to update. And if you didn't update, that meant you also got stuck with the old oat acre or the old barley acre or whatever else you might have had. So there's a lot of farms that have base acreage that doesn't really reflect what they grow today. But it was still the economic decision to keep that old base because it paid more than new base. We did not get a chance to update base acres. We had a chance to update base acres in 14, but that's only to reallocate total base acres amongst crops. It was not a chance to add base acres for, if there are acres that don't have base, there has not been a feature to add base since 2002 when we got to add oil seeds. So for practical purposes, I don't see a future policy option to add new base acres. Those will always be non-base acres. They get crop insurance, they don't get commodity programs. Right now, 18 doesn't offer us a chance to even update base acres, let alone add any. I don't know when and if we might get another chance to update base acres in the future, but to add acres is really doubtful. By the way, if there's a farm that is based versus a farm that's not, theoretically, the economist tells you that should affect farmland value, which means maybe I should go talk to the county assessor and make sure that they are aware of that too, so. Because it should affect assessed value.
Okay, well, thanks. Let's thank Brad.
Thank you, Tyler.
We'll take a break and be back here just shortly after 10:30, so grab some drinks and use the restroom if you need. We'll be back. Okay, we're going to go ahead and get started back up. Well, I know a couple people will be sliding back in here in a second. So I'm pretty excited for the next session. Maybe Nick's not as excited as I am, but so I was glad to have Nick Streff here. He's a regional director from USDA-Nass. And so, you know, there's always crop reports, crop surveys, a lot of stuff coming out from Nass. And so sometimes it's hard to keep up on what's going on and a little bit about what goes into some of those surveys and crop reports that we see a lot about. So Nick's here in Lincoln, so we're going to grab him and see if we can bring him up. So glad to have him here, and I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to you, and you can tell us all about Nass and all of the great things you do.
I can do that. All right. Good to go. All right. Well, thanks, everyone. Thanks to Tyler for inviting me. I was glad he asked me to come out here and chat with you all because, you know, I try and get in front of as many people as possible to explain, you know, what I do on a daily basis at work and, you know, what the information is and what it isn't. So today we're going to take you through just kind of a list of those things, and hopefully at the end of the day, you know, you kind of walk away with a better understanding. So first, I'm going to do a brief history of Nass, who we are, what we do, our mission, our values, what we do as an agency, what we don't do. And then I'm going to spend some time really talking about the survey process. Who do we talk to? Why did we select that farmer, that rancher? And then I'm also going to take you through the 2019 growing season. We got a lot of questions this year. You know, it was a challenging year for all across the country, you know, between floods, late planting, slow developing crop, unharvested acres that happened at the end of the year. So I'm going to take you through all that and how what Nass was doing to collect that data. And then we'll talk about some uses of Nass data if we have time and kind of the importance of that data specifically to Nebraska. So, and like I said, I hope you can walk away today with an understanding of, you know, when you see a headline that says, you know, the USDA number was this, hopefully you have a better understanding of where that really came from. All right, so first off, Nass. It stands for the National Agricultural Statistics Service. It's one of many agencies for the U.S. Department of Agriculture. We like to claim that George Washington was our first statistician. Back in 1791, he sent out a survey that had 8 questions on it to 5 states, and it focused on land values, prices, and yield. So basically, he was trying to determine, does the new young country have enough food to get through the winter? That's what he was looking for there. Then USDA was established by President Lincoln in 1862. Nass was part of it from the beginning. We had a different name at that time called the Division of Statistics. And the first report from, you know, that brand new agency came out in July of 1863. So, you know, we've been around for a long time. So let's look at who is Nass today. We have about 800 personnel scattered all across the country. We serve all 50 states and Puerto Rico. We have data collection centers, so some of our phone centers that do a lot of our phone calling for us. They're in Montana, Wyoming, Oklahoma, Missouri, and Arkansas. We have our headquarters unit out in Washington, D.C. But then also on this map here, you notice all these different colors. There are 12 regions within Nass. I sit in the regional office in Lincoln, which is in Nebraska, and we cover the states of North Dakota, South Dakota, Nebraska, and Kansas. So basically, any number that comes out of Nass for any of those 4 states in that Northern Plains region comes through our office here in Lincoln. We do all that data collection there. We have a group of about 34 people in our office in Lincoln, but we also still have trainers and kind of public-facing type folks still in North Dakota, South Dakota, and Kansas. So that's who we are today. The Nass mission statement is to provide timely and accurate and useful statistics and service to agriculture. That's our goal. So we want to make sure that the numbers we put out are policy relevant, they're objective, they're credible, that folks can trust them, and that we're committed to putting out the best number that we can find. Moving on. So what do we do as an agency? Well, we collect, assemble, process, and disseminate data. I don't know how many folks in the room are farmers or ranchers, but yes, I am the agency that mails you a survey, calls you if you don't fill it out, follows up maybe with a personal interview. Some of our surveys are 1 or 2 pages long. Some, the more longer economic ones, they can be up to 32 pages long. It can take quite a bit of time to fill out. But that's who we do. The majority of our reports are all voluntary. Aside from the Census of Agriculture, that's the only one that's mandatory. So a lot of our job is selling why the information is important, why someone should take the time to stop and fill it out. We conduct hundreds of national, regional, and state surveys every year. We publish all those reports. We conduct the Census of Agriculture every 5 years. We also partner with state ag departments, universities, and others to conduct surveys for them. We kind of had the expertise on that end. We're the ones who, we're good at designing questionnaires. We're good at analyzing data. We're good at publishing it. So, universities, a good example is, not on the university side, but on the private side, the wheat board, we used to do a wheat variety survey for them every year. They come to us because we have that expertise of being able to assemble that and put it together. And we also conduct research, on the statistics behind everything we do. And then in bold at the bottom there, we provide independent, objective, and unbiased data to everyone at the same time. That's probably one of our most important selling points is, when you look at it, there's a lot of private companies, especially nowadays, that have the resources to collect data through their own surveys, to have their own experts to estimate what they think the corn yields are going to be, how much corn was planted, or any of those numbers. But those numbers are only shared. They're either kept in-house for that firm, or you can get them through a subscription service. But it gets back to the people with the resources have the information. So that's where Nass steps in to say, we collected this data and we release it to everyone at the same time. Nobody gets it ahead of time, no big firms, and it's also a way to level that playing field, to make sure there's no biased data going into there. And I'm gonna get to talk about how big our sample size is to make sure we're doing a good job. One thing is what Nass does not do. We do not set policy. We do not have any regulatory activities. We're not a government agency like the EPA who may set some policy that you have to do something this way or that way. We do not permit influence, and we're not politically appointed. A lot of USDA agencies, there's political appointees at the top and somewhere throughout. In Nass, from our administrator all the way down, all those 800 people I talked about before, none of us are politically appointed. So, that's where none of our priorities are going to change from year to year because we have new leadership. Now, our boss at the very, very top, Secretary Perdue, yes, he's politically appointed. Other people below him are, but when it gets to Nass, we are kind of unique in that we have no political appointees. Something else that we do not do is we do not disclose individual reports. Once data comes into Nass, it doesn't leave. It's not allowed to leave. We keep it confidential. It's secure on every end from where we're looking at on our servers. The IRS can't get it. The EPA can't get it. No other government agency can get it. It stays in-house at all times. You hear from a lot of government agencies that they're subject to Freedom of Information Act requests. How much money did they pay out? Who did it go to specifically to those things? Nass is protected from those things. So any data we ever collect for any producer, for any farmer, rancher, is never shared with anyone. It stays in-house, and there's specific laws that keep it that way. And just a quick story, it was a few years ago, I got a phone call from a lawyer. It was kind of an unfortunate situation. A husband and wife were going through a divorce, and he said, I need every report that this farm has ever done. We're trying to verify production. I believe it happened to be a dairy operation. And I explained, I'm sorry, sir, we're protected. I can't share that information with you right now. And he said, okay, I'll file a Freedom of Information Act request. And I'm like, that doesn't apply to us. Here's Title V of some US law. That's not gonna work. Okay, I will see you in court and I'll subpoena it from you. Well, that day never came because once again, we're protected. Nobody can get that data. And also we go to great lengths on the disclosed individual reports to make sure when we publish the data, we're not publishing anybody's specific data. So think about it in Nebraska. Corn acres, it's gonna be hard, when you're publishing 10 million acres of corn to be able to figure out what farmer A has over here. But if you think of it on a more along the lines of, think of poultry slaughter. Now, I know things have changed now with more coming online in Nebraska, but we have to be real careful when we're looking at that data because if you have one firm that has a lot of it, they'll be able to see what all the other firms have. So we have a disclosure rule where we have to have at least 3 reports for everything we publish, and no one person can have more than 60% of that to make sure that they can't back their way into figuring out what the competition has. And also, what Nass does not do, we don't favor any groups above any other. So that's just basically saying, You know, we do livestock reports, we do specialty livestock reports, specialty crop reports. We're trying to get a big picture view of U.S. agriculture. All right, so let's talk about the types of data we collect. We collect hard data, and in that form it'd be, you know, talking to farmers and ranchers, how much area did you plant, what did you harvest, what's your cattle inventory? That's considered a hard data point. We collect grower expectations, so think coming up here in March, we'll be talking to producers. What are your intentions for planting this year? That would be an expectation report, or when in the fall of the year when we're talking to producers starting in August, what do you think your corn or beans are going to yield? Those expectation reports, we know that that's going to change over time, but that'd be an example of that. We also do objective counts and measures reports. In the fall of the year, we actually take the time to go to soybean and corn fields throughout Nebraska, and we actually count plants. We count blooms, we count stalks, we count ears, we measure the ears. So we're trying to get an objective result of what that field is going to yield. And we also have expert opinion surveys, and that would be our crop progress and condition report. That's a really popular one, especially during the growing season, where FSA and extension personnel that are out in those counties take the time to fill out the report that says this much corn is planted, this is the corn condition, this is the soil the soil moisture content. They're the ones who take care of that. So those are the different types of data Nass collects. All right, so now jumping into a few more details, let's talk about the survey process. So when we're working on a survey, we have to define, just in general, what is the survey objective? So let's say the survey objective is measuring corn production. So if that's your objective, you have to think, well, what type of questions do I need? So you got to design a questionnaire. Well, to get to a question like that, I probably have to ask planted, harvested, and yield. So that's going to help me get to that production number. Well, then you have to select the sample. Who's going to be in this survey? How many people do we need to talk to? What does it look like, you know, to get a good number, let's say for the state of Nebraska? And then we talk about assigning data collection methods. How are we going to collect this data? Through the mail, through the phone, through the internet, any of those pieces. So that's the basic part of the survey process, but I want to talk to you about how we do the sampling, how we select who's in the survey. All right, so this is an example for Nebraska. So this wouldn't apply to any other states for Nass. This is an example for Nebraska. And just to take you through this, so in that group that says strata, you can think of that as group. That's just basically saying there's 14 different groups here. And we have all of our 45,000 plus farms in Nebraska in one of these groups for this survey. They're all in there. So we have a group that's basically, they have 100 plus hay acres. That's a group of people. We have a group that's 61, total cropland, 1 to almost 200 acres. That's a group. You can jump down here, group 72. That's anybody who has dry edible pea acres. You have group 74, that's the group that has 400,000 to not quite 1.5 million bushels of grain for on-farm storage capacity. That's the group. We have dry edible beans. We have 10,000 plus acres of cropland, and then all the way down to our biggest category, they have over 1.5 million bushels of on-farm storage capacity. So think of it, every farm in Nebraska is in just one of these boxes. They may satisfy several requirements, but they're in just one. So when we're going through our sampling process, we're looking at, okay, well, in this group up here, this group 60, we may sample 1 out of every 20 of those people, sampling-wise. You know, we don't have to sample them as heavy because we're trying to measure the production side of agriculture. So there might not be as much production in that group 60 up there. And then we're also looking at, as we go down, let's say to this group 68, that total cropland, 650 acres to almost 10,000 acres. Well, there's quite a few farms in that group. So we might sample that group 1 out of every 10. As an example, we're going to start sampling it heavier and heavier as we go down. And then when we jump down here to this strata, this 95 or 97, we might sample those big groups 1 out of 3, 1 out of 2, or even 1 for 1 is what we're going for. So kind of jump ahead here. Those groups that down there are sampled much more heavily. And the reason we're doing that is because we're trying to find the production. Where's the production at? And the majority of the production is going to be in these bottom groups compared to these top groups. There's a lot of farms in these groups up here, but there's not as much production as when you add it up for here. So we're trying to tackle that production. So a question I often get when I'm talking to producers is, well, can't you talk to somebody else? Why do you have to talk to me today? Well, that's because you were the one picked to represent part of your group. So let's say, in this group I talked about, the 68 that was sampled, 1 for 10, let's say, you're the one person talking in that group for 10 other people just like you. So if you decide, I don't have time, or I don't do surveys, or I'm not going to report today, talk to me some other time, that means that I can't go to someone else. You were the one selected for that group. So I can't just go down the road, okay, he didn't want to do it, let's go to the next one. You were selected on purpose. And when you don't report, we're left to either have to estimate for you, or we're left to have to use averages for what that group looks like when we're doing our surveys. So that's where we'd much rather have actual reported data to point us in the right direction. So that's kind of how that sampling table works, and that's why we go to a specific person, and we can't just jump to the people who want to do the survey. We have to go with who was randomly selected. So all of this is random, and I know some producers say, well, if it's random, I should buy a lottery ticket because I get picked for every single survey that you guys send out. And just a side note on the survey side, we're not the only ones doing surveys out there. There's private companies doing surveys. So if you think you maybe just talked to us, there's a chance you did, but there's also a chance that it was a private company doing a survey as well. All right, let's jump ahead here. So once we get that sample selected, we jump to the survey process. We actively collect the data. We do it by phone, fax, internet, personal interview. And on the personal interview side of things, that's kind of an expensive way to collect data, but there are plenty of producers out there who said, you know what, I want someone to come to my house, I'll give the data there. I don't want to give it over the phone. I don't want to mail it back in. So if you come see me, I'll give you that data. And that's an arrangement we will work out. We don't have the resources to interview everybody, but in Nebraska, we have about 60 people who live around the state that do our personal interviews for us. They're part-time contractors for us. So they're trained to do it. So if that's what that producer is asking for, that's what we'll do. So then once the survey data comes in, we analyze it and we summarize it in the regional office. And what does that mean? That basically means a person like myself or other people on the staff in that Lincoln office, they take the time to go through and look at the data. Does it make sense? Are there any outliers? Does something look funny compared to the crop history? And we're just trying to make sure it's the best data set that we can absolutely find. And if we see something's out of place, we actually call the producers back. And it's not so much a I gotcha moment, it's more of a understanding, hey, normally you have oil sunflowers. This year you planted all non-oil. Is that correct? I just want to verify to make sure we have that data correct. A few years back, I called back a hog producer. They had a really low pigs per litter, and it just didn't seem right. They were normally did fairly well. So I called this gentleman back, and he actually started laughing because he said, I can't believe you looked at that. I'm sorry, I forgot a weight group in there. Here are the right numbers, thanks for calling. So it's just normally a real quick phone call just to verify to make sure that we didn't misunderstand something or misreport something. All right, so once we finish analyzing all that data, we make a recommendation right here in our office. So we're the first ones who would say, like in Nebraska's case, we would be the first one to say that there's 3 million hogs or something like that, or let's say 10 million acres of corn. We put that recommendation down, and then we send it to our headquarters in Washington, D.C., and they look it over one more time to make sure we didn't miss anything. There's a whole nother group that looks at it. And then from there, it goes through a lockup process. I'm going to talk about that in a little bit. It goes through a further review. It goes to the Secretary of Agriculture for signing. The Secretary of Ag signs all of our market-sensitive reports, and then the Secretary of Ag is briefed on that. And just to explain that, so when we put together a report and it's all ready to go, the Secretary comes in and he actually signs it before he even sees what's in it. He's not there to say, I think the corn yield should be higher or lower. He has no influence on that. We have the numbers put together. He just shows up, he signs it, and then we tell him what's in it. And the reason we're doing that, we're telling him what's in it so he is ready for questions that he might get when he leaves the room. So there's no influence from the Secretary of Ag exactly or any of those folks on what's in our report or what the numbers are. And then back to that part, it's released to the public and it's released to everybody in the US or whoever wants that data at the same time, so everybody has equal access. So kind of a tangent here just a little bit. A question we often get from producers is, why can't you use FSA data and RMA data to complete your reports? I was just at the FSA office. I gave them everything I have. Why can't you go get it from them? And part of the reason is because the FSA data early on in the growing season is not complete enough for Nass reports. We're always trying to figure out a way to get that data from FSA, but this last year, what was it, July 15th was the final corn and soybean certification date, or somewhere around there, is that what it was? Well, Nass puts out its first report on planting. We data collect in June 1st, and we release that report at the end of June. So that FSA data is just not complete enough for us to be able to use it. We could maybe use it for some respondents, but we couldn't use it for all of them because your certification date is later. Now, we do use FSA data at the state and national level down the road when we're doing our acreage review, so it is helpful there as it becomes more complete. And the same is true for RMA data at the end of the year. Hey, my crop insurance guy has all this data. I know it's going to be pushed to RMA eventually. Why can't you get my end of season data from that person? Well, once again, it becomes a timing issue. Nass collects the data on December 1st. We publish the final report in early January. Well, most people have their RMA data reported by then, but technically RMA is still going to be updating even this 2019 crop until December of this year. So once again, that data is not complete. So we are continuing to look for ways to utilize that data to ease the respondent burden on producers, but at the moment, the technology is just not there to be able to grab that data and pull it in. We're hoping to continue to make advancements there, but it's just not there yet. And also another thing, I think Brad already kind of talked about it. FSA has, farm numbers based, right? And I don't know how many farms are technically in Nebraska on the FSA side of things, but it's a lot more than the 46,000 farms that USDA-National says Nebraska has, because we count farms differently between the two. We're on an acres operated type thing, and they have, their little pieces that they can break off for each individual farm number. All right, so getting back to talk about Nass lockup and the security we go through to make sure nobody sees the data ahead of time. Has anybody ever seen the old movie from the 80s? It's called Trading Places. It's got Eddie Murphy in it and Dan Aykroyd. Is that the guy who's in it? Yep. That's a spoof on getting USDA data ahead of time. They were trying to intercept the Orange Crush report, right? All right. So to guard against that, because that did not happen. It wasn't a true story. That was a movie for entertainment purposes. What Nass does for all market-sensitive reports, they go through what it's called Nass lockup, where all the reports are compiled in a secure wing in the USDA South building out in Washington, D.C. So basically what that means is there are physical and electronic security measures to make sure people can't get into the area that aren't supposed to be there, and to make sure electronically that there's nothing in there so they can transmit the report out. So a little more detail here. Lockup is physically secured. There is actually an officer that stands outside. There's only one entry point. Stands outside, a security officer stands out there. You have to go through a metal detector, and you have to be on the list to get in the room. And once you get in the room, you can't leave. There's no telephone. No telephones allowed in there. There's no internet connections. There's nothing electronic in there. There are computers that we can use to work on the data, but they're not connected to the internet, and the internet connection is turned off. And only authorized personnel are in there. And like I said, once you go in there, you can't leave. So some of our lockup reports, you start at midnight. And you can't leave until the report's released at noon Eastern time. So you have to stay in there the whole time. There are bathrooms in there, but otherwise you can't leave. There's no way for you to leave once you see that data. All right, so Nass programs and products. We do over 500 reports annually every year, 9,000 state level reports, and we do the Census of Agriculture. All right. So now we're to that's kind of the history. That's our survey process, a very quick version of our survey process. Now let's talk about the 2019 growing season. It was a challenge. Nebraska was right in that mix too, from right there in March. Well, actually, the blizzards before that, the March flooding, the late planting season, you name it, producers went through it this year. So let's talk about that. But first, I have some headlines here that I kind of want to talk through. So here's a headline. After biblical spring, this is a week that could break the Corn Belt. Here's another one. Corn, flawed USDA forecast creates tremendous opportunity. Another one. Grain traders lash out after USDA trumpets flawed corn data. Investors can't stop talking about USDA's bombshell report. I think there's one more. AccuWeather predicts 2019 corn yield will be the lowest since 2012. So these are just some of the articles that were written. And none were very favorable for the agency I work for this year. It just wasn't the case. So I'll jump back to that. And one thing I kind of want to point out here is, you look at that one, flawed USDA, back up. Grain traders lash out after USDA trumpets flawed corn data. I think that's an interesting article because I don't know this author, but on there I have to ask, what part of it was flawed? Because I'm pretty sure that author did not do a survey to write that headline at all. And I'm also pretty sure, I don't know what their background is, that, this is a headline that gets clicks. This is something people are going to click on. This is something that people are going to talk about in the coffee shops. And I think part of that's okay. We want people to be discussing the data. We want people to be looking at it. But part of me also wants to say that I'm curious about what part was flawed. He just thought it was wrong. He said, I think he goes on to say, if it's in that report or maybe a different article, I'm mixing them up. Well, I drove across Ohio and this is what I saw. Well, that's important to know, but a windshield tour of a state is not going to combat how many people we talk to for our surveys. And that's kind of the point I'm going to try and stress here. So let's look at June, our June crop report. We do a quarterly report every time. This is called the June Agricultural Production Survey. So at the US level, our sample size was nearly 70,000 farmers and ranchers that we talked to, nearly 70,000. So just to put that in perspective, this is an election year. There's a lot of opinion polls out there right now, right? If you're ever looking on your TV when you say, this candidate in Iowa is leading based on a Gallup poll that said this, if you ever look in the corner, you can see on there, they'll often say how many positive reports they have. Well, some of those national level polls might have 1,200 responses. Some other ones might have 300. Some might have 2,000. But that's what they're saying, and that's what they're basing it off. And that is a statistically valid number. They put on those polls, plus or minus 4%. This is where the number is. Well, I think that's pretty interesting that that's a good number. But for USDA-Nass, we're talking to nearly 70,000 individuals. Well, sorry, I should say, we sampled 70,000 individuals. Not everybody reports to our reports, because they're voluntary. So some people choose not to. And then also, we went to another 9,000 segments. And in June, we take the time, we actually go out across all of our states. In Nebraska alone, about 350 of them. Think of a square mile. We go out there specifically identified to us. You have to go here. Who operates that land within that square mile? And what did they plant? So when you add those two numbers together, that's 68,000 plus this 9,000 here, because normally there's about 3 operators for every square mile roughly. We surveyed nearly 100,000 producers for our June number. And the interesting part about that is, those private firms, they had their thoughts. This was the only farmer reported number out there that I saw. I mean, this is truly from the producers. This is who we talk to. We don't have expert opinion panels on any of this stuff. This is from the producer. So just to show, that, that's a pretty big number of people that we talk to. In Nebraska, I have that down at the bottom there. In Nebraska, we surveyed about 3,200 people, and we had about 350 segments. So we go to great lengths to make sure we have a good indications, or a good chunk of data to predict that corn number, that sunflower number, that on-farm soybean stocks number. All right, but when we came out with our report, this is something that's up here. This is showing, if you look at the red line, that's the Nass number. In these blue dots, that's what we call the trade expectations, or what the industry expected. These are what the experts expected. So when we came out with our number in June, that's where some of those headlines came from. Nobody expected the corn number to be that high. Nobody thought that the producers got that much corn planted. All right, so we'll jump ahead. Here was the soybean number for that same June timeframe, right at 80 million acres. Nobody thought that, everybody thought that farmers got more soybeans planted. And this is the June number. But one thing specific, well, just to show here, so corn certainly takes the headlines. I'm going to focus on corn a lot more through the rest of the presentation, because corn was it's the one's driving the markets right now. It's the crop that was getting the most headlines. So corn was up 2.5 million acres from the previous year, as of our June number, but soybeans were down 9 million acres. But there were no articles written about soybeans. It was all about that corn number. But one thing about both these numbers is there was a lot of uncertainty in them because a lot of it wasn't planted. You can look here on the slides, and if you follow that corn line across, normally by June 1st, only 2% of the corn is left to be planted. Well, this year, 16% of the corn still wasn't planted. And this is based, once again, on talking to producers on what they planted and what they thought they were going to plant. And then same can be said for soybeans. You can look through there. Normally, there's about 10% left to be planted. 41% of the soybeans were still not planted as of June 1st. So what did Nass do? We needed to do a resurvey. We needed to go back to all those producers, and we did. Anybody who said they still had corn or soybeans left to plant, in these section of blue states here, we went back and talked to them because of that uncertainty. Because, we don't do this every year, but because there was that much left to be planted, we needed to go back and see, did they get that planted? So we did that in July. And then in August, we released any updates to acreage. So looking here, so we went back and talked to 7,600 people who said they still had stuff left to be planted in all those states that were listed on the slide before. And then we also, in August, I kind of have two different surveys going on here. In August is the first time we do our first yield indication, our first yield forecast for the year. And we went out and talked to 20,000 producers for that. So jumping ahead here. So this slide is kind of hard to read, but this is a slide that we had a lot of questions on what is technically in your corn number. If I plant the corn and I rip it up and then I plant it to another crop, is that in your corn number? Yes, it is, because it was planted. This is a planted number. If I planted to corn and I had to rip it up and I planted it back to corn, do you count it twice? Nope, we only count it once. So this is a document we have out on our website to explain what's included, what's not included. So jumping ahead, and you can also look at here, in August we were trying to revise that corn number. And this slide is showing, we already talked about why can't we use FSA data? If you look at the green line there, that's the FSA August data. The blue line is the FSA final data. And you can see in a year like 2013 or 2014, the FSA number from August to December moved 3 million acres. So that's another reason, to show that FSA data is not always complete for us, and that's why we can't always use it for our regular reports. And this red line here is the Nass number, the final number. We're always above the FSA data. Not everybody participates in farm programs, so there's always a little room on top of that FSA number. All right, so in August, we did revise the corn acreage. Nass did come out and do that. We revised it down 1.7 million bushels. That did happen, but that was based on that re-interview and that updated FSA data. But when we came out with that number, you can see we were still above those industry expectations, those blue dots, but you can see the industry kind of moved up some. Like, Nass is talking to the producers, so maybe it is a little bit higher than what we first expected, those numbers back in June. And then we can look at, what did we say for production? Nass said that the corn final production for the U.S. was going to be 13.9 billion bushels. Well, you can see that the industry expectations were not even close to that. The average of those blue dots on this slide is 3.2 billion bushels. So you can see when this report came out, it was bearish. It was negative on prices because the industry was not expecting the number to be where it's at. But I just want to get back to, those industry expectations are based on a lot on expert opinion, where that Nass number Well, that's based on surveying 20,000 farmers across the US. That's the farmer reported number, that red dot up there. All right, so this similar charts for soybeans. You can see, we had to make some changes to our soybean acres. Soybean acres in August, we actually revised down several million acres as well. But the soybean forecast was closer to what the trade was expecting. It was actually low, but it was within their range. So that was our August report. And now moving on to our September report. And after a while, this is going to get kind of repetitive, but I'm just trying to drive home the point of who we're talking to and why our sample sizes are pretty big, so we're fairly confident in our data. So in September, we went and talked to almost 10,000 people across the US. Our sample size in Nebraska was 540. And this is also where that objective yield comes into play. We went to 275 fields to count soybeans and to count corn. How many ears, what are the size of the ears, how many pods. We take those counts as well. And based on the farmer reported yield here and what we counted in the fields, we came out with a new number. We did revise corn down to like 13.8 billion bushels. But you can see trade came way up. All those blue dots came way up to be more around the Nass number. I can't say why they did that, but I'm kind of guessing they started to get better information. And then they also know that Nass data, was pretty strong in August. So we did revise down just a little bit. The same can be said for soybeans, down a little bit more. So let's jump ahead. Let's look at October. What happened in October? Talked to 10,000 people again. Nebraska, we talked to 551. And just a note here, on this survey, the egg yield column there, that's the farmer reported data. And then we have that objective yield on the side. That farmer reported yield is the better number of the two surveys. You'd think, going to a field and actually counting the corn, counting the pods, that's a good number to look at, but the farmers actually are the best source of the information for what the crop is going to yield. All right, so here is our October number for corn. You can see it's leveling off. Not a huge change. Similar to soybeans, down some more. All right, so let's look at November. Same thing. Once again, the Nass number, we started at 13.9 billion bushels, and now we're down to just under 13.7. So once again, this is that farmer reported yield. All right, so now let's jump to our December egg survey, the number that just came out a few weeks ago, on January 12th, I believe. So in our December egg survey, once again, I'm just trumpeting this sample size. For all of the US, we went to nearly 80,000 producers is who we talked to get a final corn number, final soybean number. In Nebraska alone, we went to over 3,200 that we talked to. All right, so here's the final. How did we do from start to finish this year? Well, I'll jump past that. How did we do from start to finish? I jumped a few slides ahead. Nass started at 13.9 billion bushels. We finished at 13.7, so a difference of 200 million bushels. So there's revisions in our crops every year. That's an adjustment of about 1.5%, okay? If you look at the trade here, which is where all those headlines come from, bombshell report from Nass, flawed corn data, look at this trade number. The average started out at 13.2. They had to come up 500 million to meet the Nass number. So they had a much bigger revision this year because of the uncertainty or because of what they thought should be happening. So soybeans didn't change much. You can see, we started out at about almost 3.7 billion bushels, and we finished at 3.55. So not a big change there. So this slide, it's in your book, so you can look at it in more detail on your own. But I'm going to jump to slide 50. It's the one that has June, August, and December. And one thing I want to kind of point out here is you look at our first to final estimates. You look at this production number. I kind of already talked about it. In such a challenging year that we ran into, our production number was revised only 1.5%. And just for reference, most years Nass, in the last 10 years, Nass has not been off by more than 5%. We go back to 2010 where Nass had first to final, the revision was like 7.6%. Most years were 5% or less. Some years were right on the money from the beginning. So just to show that farmer reported yield, all those surveys are producing good numbers. You know, we're doing our best to make sure we're putting the right numbers out there for producers. And then of course this year we did a lot of resurveys to make sure we were doing it correctly. All right, so that kind of concludes that 2019 corn, and I'll just briefly go through these slides and then I'll have some time for some questions. So who uses Nass data? Well, hopefully farmers and ranchers are using it to make management decisions, to make crop selections in terms of, you know, what should my crop mix be for the coming year. It also helps level that playing field. We talked about that. The organizations that have the resources to have this data in-house, this Nass data makes sure that everybody gets it at the same time. In that bottom note there, it provides the checks on rumors and speculations. Nass data will do that. It helps kind of reset the market every month when we come out with our report. Who else uses Nass data? Well, buyers and processors, grain elevators. It's not as common anymore, but when they were building ethanol plants across the U.S., you know, a lot more, you know, 10, 15 years ago or so, we got calls all the time in our office asking for, I need your county level corn data. We're thinking about putting an ethanol plant here, and we need to see how much corn is available to us. They used our data to determine where to put those facilities because we are the ones who were doing, you know, the county level production for estimates. Jumping ahead, who else uses our data? Well, you can think, you know, the agribusinesses, the supply firms, chemical, feed, and seed. It allows those types of companies to target certain areas in terms of, you know, if we're trying to build market share, they can look at our county estimates and determine, you know, this is the market share we have, this is where we'd like to be. And it's also important to transportation companies. Think of the rail companies in particular. What was it, 4 or 5 years ago? I believe it was hard to get locomotives down here to haul our corn, haul our beans away, because they were all up in North Dakota or wherever they might have been. So it's transportation companies can plan as well to see, you know, where is the grain at? And that's also on the next slide. Who else uses our data? Local, state, and federal lawmakers. Our data, the Nass data, is behind the scenes on a lot of the farm programs that are implemented because it's used to test, you know, if we built a program that looked like this, how would it perform? They use Nass data for that. And FSA, I mean, a lot of those slides that Brad had up earlier, you know, that national corn price, the reported one, that's data collected by Nass. We go to the elevators and we ask them, what did you pay for corn for this month? And we're the ones that help determine that market average price that feeds into this. All right, and who else uses the data? You know, the land-grant universities and producer organizations. They use our data to make sure, you know, the Corn Board might be using it to say, we have this many members, but according to Nass, there's this many corn producers out there. What can we do to increase our membership? Extension uses it quite a bit for some of their programs where it could be yield analysis. It could be economic analysis as well, you know, how are farms doing? All right, and I think this should be this one. So here's another headline. This happened in 2017, as I'm kind of wrapping up my presentation here. This happened in 2017. It was an early May weekend. Western Kansas got about 8 inches of snow on their wheat crop out there. And this was a headline, we lost the Western Kansas wheat crop this weekend. And the interesting part is that's a quote from Twitter from the Kansas Wheat Board's executive director or CEO. I forget exactly what his title is. So when the market saw this, oh my goodness, our phones were ringing off the hook because the next day was a Monday, we published our crop progress and condition report. And in that report, well, how come wheat condition didn't go down more in Kansas? What happened? You guys have to be wrong. The next week, our report came out again. It showed some changes in the wheat condition in Kansas, but not a lot. Well, when you say the western Kansas wheat crop, you lost it. Anybody know how many acres that is? That's 3 million acres of wheat. So that snowstorm did not take that out. It turns out, yes, those producers did lose some wheat that year, but I have the number right here. One more. It turns out they still harvested over 80% of their acres that got snowed on right there. So that headline certainly made the market jump around a lot, but once we got that producer reported information from our surveys, it showed that, you know, guess what? They did lose some wheat acres, but they still harvested over 80%, and they had average yields of anywhere from 39 to 48 bushels an acre. So hardly lost, but it's headlines like that that certainly get the public and the market talking. All right, so 2 more slides. So those previous slides that talked about the importance of data, who is using it, people in Nebraska use it the exact same way. We like to say, good leaders make good decisions with good data. I've been on the phone several times. There's a proposed pulse crop checkoff program that Nebraska is looking at. They're using Nass data to help determine, how many pulse crop acres are even in Nebraska? So we're trying to help with that in terms of providing the right type of data. And also other things, government leaders, they can't make informed policy decisions if they don't have the data behind it. The USDA in general can't prepare for a crisis and respond to a crisis if this data isn't there. The floods that happened in March, we helped prepare some of the data that the governor and some of those disaster boards looked at to say, where do resources need to go? All right, so that's all I have for today. This is some contact information, but my direct line contact information, my email are listed right there. I'd be more than happy to take any questions, or if you have questions in the future, don't be afraid to call me or send me an email. I'd be happy to talk you through it. That's part of my job. So. Any questions?
Right now, we're setting, looks like in the Dakotas and parts of Minnesota with unharvested acres. How are they included in any of these reports? Are they included as an estimate, or they just still out there as unharvested acres?
Both. So let me explain that. So I skipped over this slide because I didn't want to run too long on time. So after our December egg survey, we determined there were still 8% of the corn acres were still unharvested, and about 2% of the soybean acres were still unharvested at the U.S. level. But they were concentrated in certain states, mainly that northern Midwestern states there. So what's happening, we are going back to resurvey those producers just like we did earlier in the year in Minnesota, Michigan, North and South Dakota, and Wisconsin. Those are the target crops there. So in terms of how it's counted in our numbers, if it's unharvested production, there's a box on our survey that said, how many acres are unharvested and what do you expect that yield to be? We multiply that out and it ends up in the on-farm grain stocks category right now is where it's at. So it's still counted in total production, and it's also still counted in that on-farm grain stocks because that's where it's at. Now, once they get it harvested, and if they don't get it harvested, we will adjust that number, and then it'll be kind of pulled out from there. But that's where it is now, and our plan at the moment is to go back to these producers. If everything holds up and it's not too late of a spring, would be to go back and talk to them in April and hopefully publish that data in early May. So that's where it's accounted for there.
You said you maybe have some outliers. What percentage do you usually get?
It's really not always an exact percent, but when we're looking through stuff, think of all right, so think of this graph in general. Look at November, and you see that one blue dot that's a lot higher than everybody else's? This is exactly what some of our analysis software looks like. It's a lot of scatter plots. We would look at that number and we'd be like, oh, does everything look okay? Everybody else is grouped pretty well together. Do we need to call that producer back? Why are they standing out like that? So that's kind of how our analysis starts. So it varies by survey how often you have to call someone back, and it also varies by what crop you're looking at. Because when it comes to Nebraska and corn, it's not hard to find corn in Nebraska. You notice those that sampling table I showed you before? There was nothing in there that said, make sure you find corn people. We're gonna find the corn, we're gonna find the cattle folks. But if this was, let's say, a dry bean person, well, we're probably gonna look at that more closely because it's a much smaller acreage. So we don't have an exact percent on how many we call back. We just, jump in there, look, and if it looks out of place, we pick up the phone, try and call that producer back to verify, make sure we understood it correctly.
Okay. Then what, say you had the corn yield, say the average is about 150, but you have some people that maybe put it 10 bushels higher. You call that an outlier, or is that just added into the average?
Okay. Are you saying that they put it 10 bushels higher because they're really getting that, or they're trying to say, like, inflate the yield average? And the inflate one? Okay. That's a question we get quite a bit. And my best way to respond to that is, if it doesn't stick out on, what some of our analysis, we're not going to be able to find them. But I would also have to say, it doesn't really benefit anyone to either artificially lower your yield or raise your yield, because eventually if the Nass numbers over time are always going to be 2 bushels too high or 2 bushels too low, let's say over time you can graph that, the market's going to adjust to that anyway. So the best thing that the producer can do is report the correct data. You think of some of the crop, the county, there used to be some county insurance programs that looked at this, and there's just no benefit one way or the other, because you'd have to really get a big collective group of people to really influence that yield up or down. Because like you say here, you're looking at that group there, we're talking to 3,000 people. Well, how many people would have to artificially inflate it or lower it to really move that number at the state level? Another question?
Yeah. What if, well,
Okay.
I got a couple of them.
Okay.
That one year, I think you guys found 300 million bushels, then lost it later in that same calendar year in the ending stocks.
Okay.
Any reason for that?
On that,
I couldn't tell you the year.
yeah, I can't remember the year. I don't remember that one. Now, we do have a more recent adjustment to stocks, right? Are you going to have? I can talk a little bit about that one. But just in general, at the national level, we don't look at it at the state level, but at the national level, that other group of people who are looking over the data, they're looking it over for every state, and they do have a balance sheet that they're working with. What's imported, what's exported, what went to ethanol, and that feed and residual, that's getting a lot of press right now. That I think in an article I read, it's the big black hole. It's just what makes the balance sheet work. You just throw everything else there. So in terms of that, when it comes to corn, it's just those assumptions. And it's not always all of Nass. Part of it is the World Ag Outlook Board. They're looking at it as well. So I can't exactly speak to, why it was revised, down and then back up and came back the same year. Now I know on soybeans, we probably have a better handle on that because we have that crushing data. So we kind of know what's coming through on soybeans. But, yeah.
Then another question I had, any satellite imaging?
Oh.
Do you truth that at all as far as the survey compared to that?
Yes, I didn't show that, but yes, during the growing season and also throughout the growing season, we do use remote sensing data to help us with our surveys. Now, the farmer reported data is still better. So each year we're comparing with that satellite imagery, but we do use it, and we also use satellite imagery on our yield calculations as well. But it's just one piece of it. So we are using it regularly throughout the growing season. I don't have it in here, but Nass does publish, the different vegetative indexes to show what it is. So that is being considered, and every year that satellite data is getting better and better. And so maybe in the future we could use it more, but right now it's still paired with that farmer data, because the farmer reported information, we still have yet to find anything that's better than that at the moment. But that's where that satellite imagery can be used with it to make sure we're interpreting the data correctly.
Then this last fall, we received a sample or survey from you guys, and it's pretty in depth.
Mm-hmm.
And to do it right, it would have took 5 to 8 hours or more than
Okay.
that in my time.
Yep.
So there's producers that will not go to that extent to do it.
Correct.
So
Yeah.
how do you adjust the numbers that they're just filling in the blank just to get through it, so you guys don't call them and bug them?
Well, so part of that was probably our ARMS 2 survey. I'm just guessing if you got it in the fall. And that's a big survey. There's a lot of questions to it, because on that survey, we pick a specific field and we want to ask, what tractors did you drive across that field? What implements? What pesticides and herbicides did you put down? What seeding rate? When you harvested it, how many times did you drive the grain cart across it? All of that information is there. So it is a long survey. And then it gets into this spring, well, right now we're going to start a survey where we look at all the economic impact of that. And for the producers who won't do it, we understand it's voluntary. But what we're asking for is, that ARMS 2 report right there, that's one that we can use a lot on the publicity side of things for the farmers and ranchers. It's the one that shows that, farmers and ranchers only put down this much of glyphosate, let's say. And if we don't have data behind it, then, you can see articles that write, farmers just spray Roundup everywhere and that's just what they do and they kill everything. Well, that ARMS 2 data actually shows the producers aren't doing that. They're actually pretty good stewards of the land when it comes to those things. So, and in terms of, like you said, if they're not filling it out correctly or filling it out quickly, once again, we can pull those reports together, an analysis tool like that. And if anything stands out, we can make adjustments, call them back. And on that survey you mentioned there, we do mail it out, but a lot of them we try and do those longer ones by personal interview because it's really intensive and it takes a long time. So those are the lower response rate surveys. They're hard to do. So.
Nick, I have a question for you that deviates from crops.
Okay.
Livestock question, but
okay.
I want to put you on the spot if I can. Can you explain how Nass sort of defines, let's use the new poultry activity going on in the state? There's a poultry operation. It's a firm that owns the birds, et cetera, contracts with growers. What counts as a operator? What counts as production? How do you put a value on it?
Okay.
We're worried or we're challenged with those kinds of things right now to figure out what's the economic impact of this. Well, when does it count as production? Does it count as production for a producer? Does it count as production for the firm? But it never trades in the market, so it never technically has a market price attached to it. How do you calculate those statistics?
Okay, so on that side of things, and hogs are going to be similar. So just in terms of, let's talk about how we collect that data. So when you're looking at parts of agriculture that are have contractors and contractee type situations, and that's very popular in hogs and in poultry. When we collect the data, we collect it from the owners of those animals. So we go to the contractors in those situations. We don't go to all the different finishing barns throughout the state. We don't go through all the different poultry grower houses throughout the state. We go to the company level and get the data. So that's the one spot we want to make sure we're not double counting. So that's the first part.
And to interrupt there.
Yep.
So if you talk to the owner, does all that count in the owner's location then, or do you parcel it back out to the physical location?
We get it by state.
By state.
Yep.
So Costco poultry birds, you won't count them in every county that they're growing in. You'll count them
Just
state number.
At the moment, the poultry number is only going to be at the state level. Yep.
And a hog number similar. A hog is grown for a contractor.
Yep.
You won't count that number all the way down to the county where it's actually growing. It counts only in the state.
Yep. Yes. Yep. And so yes, when we're doing it, for our regular annual surveys or quarterly surveys, even for hogs, we're just talking, to the owner, and it goes to that state number, So, because if we didn't do that, think of some of the biggest, poultry and biggest, hog folks, it'd go at where they're headquartered. But no, we parse it out. We get the inventory by state. Now, when it comes to the Census of Agriculture, that's the one time for poultry and for hog folks where we actually do go to the contractees so we can get that data at the county level and publish it. So that's the one time we can get it that way. And then you still run into some companies have company-owned barns out there. So then at the census time is when we try to ask them, can you give us your company-level inventory by county? And there's even enough bigger producers in Nebraska that we need to do the same thing, We get, a large hog or even a large cattle, think there's certain folks who own multiple feedlots. Well, we get one feedlot number for them during the year, but in census time, we're going to ask them to break it out so we can get it in the right county. Now, in terms of that poultry value and production, Nebraska has been added to a lot more of the poultry programs because of the activities, as the poultry is growing in here, but we're not big enough to be published yet at the moment. So eventually, if we cross that threshold and we can be published and there's no disclosure issues, then you'll start seeing, a Nebraska number for poultry value and production. And that's a report that Nass publishes in April every year. At the moment, Nass is just included in that other states. We've been added to the weekly broiler program, because companies are hatching eggs every week. So, we're in that program, but we're grouped in other states right now. So there is a value there. It's just that you can't see it for Nebraska yet.
But even where you count value.
Mm-hmm. Oh, yep.
Even where you can count a value, since it's a bird that's company-owned, all the way from hatching to store shelf, when do you attach a market value to it?
I think on the poultry side of things, I think the value is still attached, when it's marketed. So, because we have marketings throughout, yep.
Shipped to the processing plant, there's some imputed value that's put on that bird.
Exactly, and the same thing can be said is true for hogs, where, there's companies who own hogs and they go to their own slaughter facilities, technically, there's a value trading hands there. It's within the same company, but technically there's a value that's assigned to it. Yep.
No more darts? They're all out of ammo.
Okay. Well, I just, once again, thanks to Tyler for bringing me up here. I really appreciate it. If any questions about Nass surveys in the future, or you got something, and, I take a lot of phone calls. We've had a lot more this year than normal. Give me a call if something doesn't make sense, or if you want to give me a call and say, Nick, I only want to report to you, that's fine. There's a lot of people that I'm the only one who can contact them to get the data, so I'd be more than willing to help out or, set up maybe a data reporting arrangement. That's part of my job to make sure we're getting good numbers.
Okay, let's thank Nick for. Yeah, thanks, and thanks for sharing a little insight. Hopefully, you all learned something new on that and the insights and the challenges that I sometimes have to do surveys too, and I don't envy you. And statistics all at the same time. Surveys and statistics sounds rough. And Tyler was one of our crop progress reporters for several years, right? I still am, but don't tell anyone that. So, I run incognito. I don't stay up here like that, like you. Okay, well, thanks. That's it for today. We'll be back here next week. We'll have Aaron Hurd and Corey Schmidt, both within RCS. We'll also have someone here from UNL talking about some of the cover crop research they have. So it'll be mostly soils and cover crops next week. So thanks, and we'll hopefully see you next week.